Have you ever imagined what happens when an elderly woman with Alzheimer's slips out of her home in the middle of the night and is found by someone completely unexpected? This story will move you from beginning to end because it shows that even in the most fragmented memories, there can be a truth powerful enough to change an entire family. So, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because what's about to unfold is unforgettable. Evelyn Parker had once been a woman full of strength, warmth, and life. She raised her daughter on her own after losing her husband too young, carried a home on her back through financial hardships, and never lost her gentle smile. But Alzheimer's had stripped away pieces of her day by day, like fragile pages torn from a book. Now, there were moments when she didn't recognize her own daughter, mistook her grandson's name, or forgot entire meals. Inside the Miller household, life had turned into a constant battle between tenderness and exhaustion. Susan Parker, Evelyn's only daughter, carried most of the weight. By day, she worked long hours at a local bank, and by night she returned home to care for her mother, trying to balance bills, laundry, meals, and medicine schedules. She loved her mother deeply, but there were nights when guilt crushed her for not being patient enough. Robert Miller, Susan's husband, saw things with cold practicality. In his eyes, the disease was a burden, one the family couldn't continue to carry alone. "This isn't sustainable, Susan. We need professional care, a facility. This is destroying our lives," he would say, his tone firm, leaving no space for argument. His words stabbed Susan's heart like knives. She knew he wasn't entirely wrong, but to her, sending her mother to a clinic felt like abandonment. And then there was Ethan Miller, their teenage son. To him, Evelyn was not just an old woman slipping away into confusion. She was the grandmother who had once told him bedtime stories, who had taught him to plant sunflowers in the backyard, who smelled of fresh-baked bread and peppermint. He refused to see her as only a patient. Even when she stared at him with vacant eyes and whispered the wrong name, he would smile and softly remind her, "It's me, Grandma. It's Ethan." One evening, tension weighed heavy in the air. Susan struggled to prepare dinner while Robert flipped through unpaid bills at the table, his frustration growing louder by the minute. Evelyn sat quietly in her recliner, her gaze fixed on nothing, as if she were watching a scene invisible to everyone else. Ethan, sitting nearby, watched his grandmother with worry etched across his face. After dinner, the family settled into their nightly routines. Susan believed her mother was tucked safely into her bedroom, as usual, but Evelyn, guided by fragments of memory and instinct stronger than logic, rose from her bed silently. Her hands, once steady in baking and sewing, now fumbled with the front lock, yet with surprising determination she managed to turn it. The cold night air wrapped around her frail body as she stepped outside, disappearing into the darkness. Minutes later, Susan went to check on her mother and found the bed empty. Panic gripped her chest instantly. "Mom! Mom!" she shouted, racing through the house. Her cries echoed against the walls. Ethan bolted from his room, his heart pounding. Robert reached for the phone and dialed the police, his voice controlled but tense. The weight of fear fell heavy on Susan's shoulders. Her mother was out there, alone, vulnerable, unprotected, wandering through a world she no longer recognized. Every second that passed could mean danger. The suburban streets of their Massachusetts town were unusually quiet that night, lit only by the dim glow of street lamps and the pale reflection of the moon. As Susan ran from house to house, knocking on doors, pleading with neighbors, each shake of the head deepened her despair. "How could I let this happen?" she whispered to herself, gasping for breath. "I should have checked earlier. I should have locked the door." Her self-blame was relentless. Robert, though outwardly calm, pressed his frustration into sharp words. "I warned you this could happen, Susan. You can't do this on your own." He didn't mean it as cruelty, but his tone was harsh, and in her fragile state it felt like accusation rather than support. Meanwhile, Ethan sprinted down the street with only his flashlight and sheer determination. "Grandma, it's me, Ethan!" His voice cracked with desperation, echoing into the night. He imagined her frightened, lost, maybe hurt, and the thought clawed at his chest. But deep down, hope kept him running. Back at the house, Susan collapsed into the living room chair, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Her mind replayed every moment she had lost patience with her mother, every sigh, every scolding, every time she had failed to offer compassion. Each memory stabbed like guilt renewed. "If something happens to her," she sobbed, "I'll never forgive myself." Neighbors spread out in small search groups while police cruisers began patrolling nearby streets. The flashing lights gave a surreal glow to the quiet town, but for Susan, it all blurred into panic. Time seemed to accelerate. With every tick of the clock, Evelyn drifted farther into the night, and the fear of losing her forever pressed heavier on her chest. Robert tried to take control, making calls, organizing search routes, yet beneath his stern voice was unease. He was a man who preferred solutions that money or systems could buy, but tonight neither offered comfort. The thought that his mother-in-law might vanish into the shadows unsettled even him. Out in the darkness, Evelyn walked slowly, her thin sweater no match for the cold. But in her mind it was not night, it was a memory, a sunlit afternoon from decades earlier. She believed she was returning home, following a call from the past. Every storefront, every street corner triggered flashes of old recollections. A bakery's aroma made her smile. She was back at the little shop where she once bought bread with her husband. The squeak of a distant swing reminded her of Susan as a child, pigtails bouncing, laughter filling the air. Eventually, her wandering led her to the town square. There, a weathered wooden bench sat beneath a street lamp. To Evelyn, it wasn't just a bench. It was the very spot where she had shared her first kiss with her late husband. She reached out and touched the wood as though it carried his warmth. Slowly she sat, closed her eyes, and let the fragmented visions wash over her. In her mind, she wasn't an old woman lost in the night. She was young again, in love, embraced by memories more real than the present. A soft smile spread across her lips. Back at home, Susan gripped Ethan's empty backpack, knowing her son was still out searching. Her heart pounded with dread. She prayed silently, "Please, God, let her be safe, please." But Evelyn remained on that bench, wrapped not in fear, but in the comforting illusion of memory, and she had no idea that her disappearance would soon reveal a secret that would change her family forever. The search dragged on into the late hours, and every minute that passed without finding Evelyn tightened the knot of fear in Susan's chest. Police cruisers combed the area with spotlights, neighbors carried flashlights through side streets, and Robert paced in frustration, barking into his phone. Ethan, though, refused to return home. He believed, no, he knew, that his grandmother was somewhere following her memories. He remembered the way she used to talk about the town square, the park bench where she first met his grandfather, and the little bakery on Main Street. If I were her, that's where I'd go, he thought. He ran across streets and cut through alleys, his sneakers slapping against the wet pavement. The night air was cold, and every breath burned in his lungs, but his determination carried him forward. "Grandma, it's me, Ethan, where are you?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the silence of the empty streets. Meanwhile, Susan sat in the living room, trembling. Her guilt was unbearable. She saw flashes of every moment when she had snapped at her mother for forgetting something simple. Every sigh of frustration now echoed back at her, as if the universe were punishing her for not being more patient. "If she doesn't come back," Susan whispered through tears, "I'll never forgive myself." Robert entered, phone in hand, his jaw tight. "The police are widening the search," he said, his tone clipped. But instead of easing Susan's fear, it felt like a verdict. His practicality always sounded like judgment. "This wouldn't have happened if you had agreed to the facility months ago," he added under his breath. Susan's heart broke. She knew he was scared too, but his words felt like blame. "She's my mother, Robert. she said sharply, her voice trembling. I'm not locking her away like she's some burden we can just ship off. Robert exhaled hard, running a hand through his hair. This isn't about abandonment, this is about reality. She's sick, Susan. And now she's out there, God knows where, because we're pretending we can handle this on our own. The tension cut through the room, but before Susan could reply, the door burst open. Ethan stood there, panting, flashlight in hand, his face flushed from running. I think I know where she went, he gasped. Without waiting, he explained about the park bench, the stories Evelyn always told about meeting his grandfather there. Susan's eyes widened. Of course, she whispered. How hadn't she thought of it? Within minutes, Susan and Ethan were back out in the car, Robert following reluctantly. The rain had turned into a misty drizzle, coating the streets in a thin shine. Susan's hands shook on the steering wheel as she prayed silently, her eyes darting across sidewalks, hoping to catch a glimpse of her mother. When they reached the square, Ethan was the first to spot her. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, Evelyn sat on the wooden bench, her frail figure wrapped in a stranger's coat. Beside her was a man, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, with tired eyes, but a gentle expression. He looked like someone used to the night, someone who belonged to silence. "Mum!" Susan cried, leaping out of the car before it fully stopped. She ran to Evelyn, kneeling in front of her. Tears streamed down her face as she touched her mother's cold hands. Thank God, thank God. Evelyn blinked slowly, her gaze hazy. You came, she murmured softly, as though Susan were a child again. I knew you'd come. Susan nodded frantically, choking on her tears. Of course I came, Mum. I'll always come. But her attention quickly shifted to the man sitting quietly beside Evelyn. His presence was calm, almost protective. He stood awkwardly as Susan looked at him with suspicion. Who are you? What are you doing with my mother? The man raised his hands slightly, his voice gentle. My name's Daniel. I work nights as a security guard at the hardware store down the block. I saw her sitting here alone. She looked confused. So I stayed. Ethan stepped closer, his young face tense. Did she say anything to you? He asked. Daniel hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Evelyn. She called me by a name. Anthony. She kept saying I promised I'd come back. I don't know what it meant. The name struck Susan like lightning. Anthony? She repeated, her voice catching. Her father's name had been Anthony Parker, but the way Evelyn had spoken, it didn't sound like she was recalling her husband. It sounded different. Robert finally approached, folding his arms. We're grateful you stayed with her, he said curtly to Daniel, but we'll handle it from here. Wait, his tone was dismissive, but Susan couldn't shake the way Evelyn's eyes lingered on the man, as if she recognized him in some secret corner of her memory. Evelyn squeezed Daniel's hand unexpectedly, her frail fingers tightening with surprising strength. You came back, she whispered again, tears glistening in her eyes. The family froze. Daniel looked down, visibly shaken. For a moment, something raw flickered across his face. Grief, longing, recognition. He pulled his hand gently free and cleared his throat. She's safe now. That's what matters. Susan, torn between gratitude and suspicion, studied him. There was something in his expression, in the way Evelyn clung to him, that didn't feel like coincidence. But Robert ushered everyone back to the car, muttering about getting her home and warmed up. As they drove away, Susan glanced in the rearview mirror. Daniel was still standing under the street lamp, watching them go, his face half lost in shadow. Back home, Evelyn was tucked into bed, still murmuring fragments of names and songs. Ethan sat beside her, notebook in hand, scribbling every word she said. She's trying to tell us something, Mom, he insisted quietly. I can feel it. Susan sat on the edge of the bed, stroking her mother's hand. She wanted to believe Ethan, but fear gnawed at her. What if it's just the illness? What if these are only broken pieces of her mind? Ethan shook his head firmly. No, they're not random. She kept calling him Anthony, and she calmed down with that man in the park. Did you see her? It was like she knew him. Susan didn't reply, but deep inside she knew Ethan was right. Something about that night didn't add up. Later, as she cleaned the kitchen, she found herself staring out the window, replaying the image of Daniel sitting beside her mother. His silence, his reluctance to speak, the way Evelyn clung to him, it all felt like part of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed. When Robert came in, his words only deepened the tension. "This is exactly why she needs a facility, Susan. This can't happen again. We were lucky tonight." Susan's anger flared. Lucky? She could have died out there. And all you can think about is shipping her away? She's my mother, Robert. She's not a problem to solve. She's a life to protect. Robert threw up his hands, exasperated. "I'm trying to protect you. Protect Ethan. You can't keep sacrificing yourself for her like this." Susan's voice broke. "She sacrificed everything for me. I won't abandon her now." The argument ended in silence. But Susan's resolve only hardened. She knew there was more to her mother's wandering than confusion. Somewhere buried in Evelyn's fragmented memory was a truth the disease hadn't erased. And Daniel, whoever he was, held part of that truth. That night, as rain tapped against the windows, Susan sat alone in the living room, staring at the phone in her hands. She considered calling the hardware store, asking for Daniel, but fear stopped her. Fear of what she might discover. Upstairs, Ethan whispered to his grandmother as she drifted in and out of sleep. "Don't worry, Grandma. I'll help you remember. I'll figure it out. I promise." And in the quiet darkness, Evelyn smiled faintly, as though she had heard and understood. What none of them knew was that the past was stirring, rising through the cracks of Evelyn's fading memory. And soon, the secret she carried would come to light, whether the family was ready or not. The following morning brought little comfort to the Miller household. Evelyn remained in bed, her frail body wrapped in blankets, murmuring fragments of songs and names that made little sense to anyone but herself. Susan hovered near her, exhausted from a sleepless night, while Robert buried himself in work emails, avoiding conversation. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, scribbling in his notebook. Every word Evelyn muttered, he wrote down. Dates, places, phrases that seemed disconnected. To him, they weren't nonsense. They were breadcrumbs. "She's trying to tell us something," he whispered to his mother, holding up the notebook filled with messy scrawls. "I think she remembers more than we realize." Susan sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Honey, I want to believe that, but Alzheimer's doesn't work like that. Sometimes it's just fragments, bits of the past jumbled together." But Ethan shook his head firmly. "No. Did you see her last night with that man? She was calmer with him than she's been in weeks. It's not random. She knows him somehow." The memory of Daniel's face under the street lamp returned to Susan like a haunting echo. His silence, his hesitation when asked about Evelyn, the way her mother clung to him, it all gnawed at her. She wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, but deep inside she felt Ethan was right. That afternoon, Susan made a decision. She left Evelyn resting in bed and told Robert she was running errands. Instead, she drove to Main Street, parking in front of the hardware store where Daniel worked night security. The place was quiet in the daylight. She found him sitting outside, sipping coffee from a paper cup, looking like a man who had already lived 1,000 nights of solitude. "Daniel," she called cautiously. He looked up, startled, then stood quickly as though caught doing something wrong. "Susan," he said, his voice careful, "I wasn't expecting you. I need answers," she said firmly, her voice trembling but determined. "Last night wasn't random. My mother looked at you like she knew you. She called you Anthony. That's not something she does with strangers." Daniel's eyes dropped to the ground. He shifted uncomfortably, his coffee cup tightening in his grip. "I told you." She was confused. Alzheimer's patients often mistake people for others. "It doesn't mean anything." Susan stepped closer, her frustration rising. "Don't lie to me. You hesitated last night. I saw it. You know something. Who are you to her?" The man's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing, his silence speaking louder than words. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of decades pressed down on him. "I knew Evelyn a long time ago," he admitted softly. Susan's breath caught. "You knew her?" Daniel nodded, his eyes still averted. "Before she married your father, before the life you know. We were young, and for a while, we were everything to each other." The world seemed to tilt beneath Susan's feet. She gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. "You're saying you were in love with my mother?" Daniel finally met her eyes. His gaze was raw, filled with a mixture of sorrow and tenderness. "Yes, but her family didn't approve. They thought I wasn't good enough for her. I didn't come from money, didn't have the right education. They pushed her into a different path. And she did what was expected. She married Anthony Parker." Susan's heart pounded in her chest. Her entire life, she had believed she knew her mother's story, every chapter. But here stood a man unraveling an entirely hidden part of Evelyn's past. "My father," Susan whispered. "She loved him." Daniel nodded. "Of course she did. But it doesn't erase what came before. We had dreams, plans, a life we thought we'd share. And then it was gone." His voice cracked, and he looked away, blinking back the weight of memory. Susan struggled to process. Anger, confusion, grief, all collided inside her. Why now? Why appear now after all these years? "I didn't plan it," Daniel replied quickly. "I saw her sitting there alone on that bench, the same bench where we used to meet. When she looked at me and said my name, it felt like time had collapsed, like we were 20 again." His voice faltered. "I couldn't walk away." Tears stung Susan's eyes. She wanted to shout, to accuse him of stirring up chaos when her mother was already so fragile. But she couldn't ignore the truth shining in his eyes. Her mother had carried a secret love her entire life. Does she remember you?" Susan asked in a whisper. Daniel hesitated. In flashes, I could see it in her eyes last night. For a moment, she wasn't lost. She knew me. Susan pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed. All these years, she never said a word. She never told me any of this. Daniel's expression softened. Maybe she thought it was better that way. Maybe she wanted to protect you from a complicated truth. Or maybe the pain of what we lost was too much to put into words. Before Susan could respond, her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. His voice on the other end was urgent. "Mom, you need to come home. Grandma's asking for him. She keeps saying his name over and over. She won't calm down." Susan froze, her eyes darting back to Daniel. His face paled as he heard Ethan's voice through the phone. "She wants to see you," Susan whispered. Daniel shook his head, backing away slightly. "No, I don't want to make things worse." But Ethan's desperate voice broke through the line. "Please, Mom, she's crying. She needs him." Susan ended the call, her decision made. "Come with me," she said to Daniel. He hesitated for only a moment before nodding, the fear and longing in his eyes, betraying the battle inside him. When they arrived at the house, Evelyn was restless, her hands trembling as she pulled at the blanket. Her voice cracked as she repeated the same word, "Anthony, Anthony." Her frail body seemed to collapse under the weight of memory. Daniel stepped into the room, and instantly Evelyn's gaze shifted. For a fleeting moment, her cloudy eyes cleared and she whispered, "You came back." Tears streamed down her cheeks. Daniel's throat tightened. He knelt beside her, gently taking her hand. "I never left, Evelyn. Not really." Susan stood in the doorway, frozen, as her mother smiled with a peace she hadn't shown in years. Ethan scribbled frantically in his notebook, knowing this was a moment worth preserving. Robert, standing behind them, shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "This is madness." But Susan knew it wasn't madness. It was truth, messy, painful, but undeniable. Her mother's fragmented memories had led her back to the man she once loved. And now, whether they liked it or not, the past had broken through the present. For the first time in decades, Evelyn looked like herself again, alive, whole and radiant, even through the haze of illness. And Susan realized that the secret her mother had carried was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of them now. The living room was quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock. Evelyn's frail hand remained clasped in Daniel's, her breathing steadier now. The storm of confusion that usually clouded her eyes seemed to have lifted, replaced by a gentle recognition that pierced through the haze of Alzheimer's. Susan stood frozen near the doorway, her emotions tangled in knots. She had spent years believing she knew her mother's story, every sacrifice, every decision, every moment of love and loss. Yet here was Daniel, a man who should have been nothing more than a stranger, holding the missing chapter in Evelyn's life. Robert shifted uncomfortably behind her. His arms were crossed, his jaw tight. "This is absurd," he muttered, though his voice betrayed unease. "She's sick. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Ethan turned on him fiercely, his young face flushed with conviction. "No, she does. Look at her. She knows him. She hasn't been this calm in months. You can't pretend this doesn't mean something." Evelyn's lips moved, and though her voice was faint, everyone leaned closer. They told me to forget," she whispered, "but I never did. Daniel, you were always here." Her hand pressed lightly to her chest, as if guarding a secret she had carried for decades. Daniel's eyes brimmed with tears. "And I never stopped loving you," he admitted softly, his voice breaking. Susan gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. It was one thing to suspect, another to hear it spoken aloud. The weight of the truth pressed down on her chest. Evelyn's breathing grew ragged for a moment, and Susan rushed to her side. "Mom, it's okay. You don't have to fight anymore. We're here." But Evelyn shook her head weakly. "No, Susan, you must know. I wanted to tell you. Your father, he was a good man. I loved him. But Daniel was my first love, my only love. They forced me away. I never stopped remembering." Her words tumbled out, fragmented but clear enough to shatter everything Susan thought she knew. Robert turned sharply, his voice hard. "And what good does this do now? Digging up ghosts from 50 years ago. It doesn't change anything." But Susan spun on him, her voice trembling with fury. "It changes everything. She carried this alone for decades, Robert. You think that doesn't matter? You think her truth isn't worth hearing just because it's inconvenient for us?" Ethan placed his notebook on the table, his pencil trembling in his hand. "I wrote it all down," he said. "Grandma's words, her stories. We can't lose them again." Indeed, Daniel stroked Evelyn's hand gently, his voice low. "I'm sorry for the pain. I never meant to cause this. But seeing her again, it feels like fate gave us one last chance." Tears streaked down Susan's face as she sat beside her mother. "All this time I thought I understood you, Mom. I thought I carried your legacy. But I didn't know half of who you were. And now," her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. Evelyn's weak fingers reached out, brushing her daughter's arm. "You know now," she whispered. "That's enough." The room fell into silence, heavy with the weight of generations. Later that night, after Robert stormed upstairs, Susan sat in the dim glow of a lamp, watching Daniel hum a lullaby softly to Evelyn. It was the same tune Evelyn had sung absent-mindedly in her moments of confusion, the song that had puzzled Susan for years. Now it all made sense. It wasn't random. It was memory. It was love. Ethan curled on the couch, still awake, scribbling notes with fierce determination. "We'll keep it alive, Grandma," he whispered into the quiet. "Your story won't be forgotten." In the days that followed, the fragile truce of that night grew into something unexpected. Daniel returned often, sitting quietly with Evelyn, telling her stories of their youth, bringing back fragments of laughter that Susan had long forgotten. Sometimes Evelyn's eyes would clear, her smile soft and full of recognition. Other times, she drifted away again, lost in the fog of the disease. But through it all, Daniel remained steady. Robert's disapproval never wavered, but Susan no longer cared. Her anger at him burned out, leaving only clarity. She realized she had spent years carrying guilt for being impatient, for not understanding. But Evelyn's story showed her that even the strongest people had hidden struggles. Her mother wasn't just a victim of Alzheimer's. She was a woman who had lived, loved, and sacrificed more than Susan had ever imagined. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Evelyn's voice broke the silence. "Susan," she said clearly, her eyes unusually bright, "promise me something." Susan leaned forward quickly. "Anything, Mom. When I'm gone, don't bury me with silence. Tell my story. Let them know I loved. Let them know I lived." Susan's throat tightened. "I promise." Daniel's hand trembled as he held Evelyn's. "And I'll make sure the world remembers too," he said quietly. Ethan closed his notebook with finality. "We already started. Grandma, you're safe now. Your story is safe." The family gathered close as Evelyn closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her back into rest. Her chest rose and fell gently, and though the disease still lingered, the fear in her face was gone. She had spoken her truth, and in that truth, there was peace. Weeks later, Evelyn passed quietly in her sleep. It was a loss that shook them, but not the same hollow grief Susan had feared. This time, it was filled with a bittersweet comfort. Her mother had not left the world carrying her secret alone. At the funeral, Susan stood before friends and family, Ethan by her side. She spoke not just of Evelyn the mother, but of Evelyn the woman, her strength, her sacrifices, her hidden love. Daniel stood in the back, head bowed, tears streaming silently. When Susan finished, she looked directly at him. For a moment, their eyes locked. No words were exchanged, but there was understanding, gratitude, forgiveness. Afterward, Ethan slipped his notebook into Susan's hands. "We should publish it one day," he said softly. "Not as gossip, as a reminder that love is stronger than memory." Susan smiled through her tears. "Yes, we will." And as the family walked out of the church, the sunlight breaking through storm clouds above, Susan felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Her mother's story was no longer a hidden wound. It was a legacy. This tale, born of fragments and silence, had become whole again. And if you believe that even when memory fades, love remains unbroken, then share this story. Subscribe to our channel and join us, because stories like Evelyn's remind us that the heart never forgets, even when the mind does.